What if I told you that the harshest test on the American frontier was invisible? It wasn't conflict with indigenous peoples or the hardships of the long journey, but a silent, pervasive enemy that came every winter, the cold. When the icy wind began to blow from the Rocky Mountains and the prairies were covered with an impenetrable layer of snow, survival turned from a daily task into an hourly engineering feat. For pioneer families, it was a time when the walls of their modest dwellings became the boundary between life and certain death. Watch the video to the end to learn how simple engineering solutions and the psychology of work allowed entire families to survive the freezing winters, and how one seemingly insignificant mistake in insulating their home could have cost them everything. I will reveal the best-kept secret of survival on the frontier. Almost all the preparation that the settlers did turned out to be useless. Families arriving from the east brought with them heavy trunks filled with things they considered necessary for life in the new land. They brought expensive furniture, fine fabrics, and sophisticated tools, believing that these supplies would be enough to get them settled and through their first winter. This confidence was their biggest mistake, an illusion that quickly dissipated with the first frost. The reality of the frozen frontier turned out to be much harsher. The fragile tools brought from a milder climate broke in the severe cold. Metal became brittle and wood cracked. Clothing that was ideal for civilized cities instantly became soaked and could not protect against the piercing wind of the Great Plains. It turned out that survival depended not on what you brought with you, but on what you could create on the spot from materials at hand. There was a rapid and painful shift in consciousness. The settlers began to understand that their survival depended on knowledge, not things. They were forced to learn from the very land on which they were trying to survive. They began to notice what materials the local tribes used, although they did not always understand the logic behind their choices. This process of adaptation was key to staying alive, and it required a complete rejection of previous ideas about comfort in everyday life. Instead of relying on their supplies, they began to study local resources, which wood burns longer and gives off more heat, and which only smokes and burns quickly, which clay is best suited for filling gaps in log walls, which herbs and mosses could be used for additional insulation by stuffing them between the logs. This seemingly primitive knowledge was worth its weight in gold. Gradually, a new way of thinking emerged, which could be called renewable resource thinking. An imported axe was just a tool that could break, but knowing how to find suitable wood, dry it, and make a new handle was a skill that ensured survival. This skill could not be bought or brought with you in a trunk. It could only be acquired through hard experience. That first year was a filter that weeded out those who could not adapt. Families who continued to cling to their Eastern habits and possessions often did not live to see spring. Those who showed flexibility and a willingness to learn discovered simple but ingenious engineering solutions that formed the basis of survival on the frontier. It was not a battle for territory, but a battle for adaptation. The uniqueness of this situation was that education and social status were irrelevant. A professor or banker from Boston found himself in a much more vulnerable position than a simple farmer accustomed to working with his hands and observing nature. The skills that were valued in the East, literacy, business acumen, became useless in the face of the icy wind. Completely different competencies were required. The settlers understood that the main mistake was rigid planning. They could draw up an ideal plan, but one early snowfall or an unexpected thaw that turned everything to ice would ruin those plans. Survival required not following a plan, but the ability to improvise using the minimum that was at hand. The ability to repair what was broken rather than throw it away and replace it was fundamental. Knowledge of how to survive the winter became the main legacy passed down through the family. It was not money or land, but practical skills. How to build a stove so that it did not smoke. How to keep supplies from freezing. How to make a dwelling airtight. This knowledge was the only real value in a world where winter lasted 6 months. Ultimately, the first winter was devoted not to settling in, but to learning. It was a harsh lesson that showed that the nature of the frontier does not forgive mistakes and pride. Those who manage to humble their pride and accept the new harsh rules of the game survive. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think was more important? The material supplies they brought with them or the intangible skills they acquired on the spot? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about the most famous symbol of the Wild West? The log cabin? In paintings and movies, it looks like a reliable and cozy fortress. However, for settlers who faced the real winters of the plains, a log cabin often became a cold trap. Despite the thickness of the logs, the main enemy of such a structure was gaps. Joints, corners, and gaps between logs were all open gates for the icy wind. Ironically, another type of dwelling, the sod dugout, or soddy, was much more effective, albeit less prestigious. Settlers on the Great Plains, where wood was scarce, were forced to build houses from the only material available, the earth itself. They cut the top layer of soil with thick grass into long layers, similar to bricks, and stacked them to form walls. The secret of the dugout lay in its construction. The walls were made incredibly thick, often up to 1 meter wide. This created what we would today call a thermal mass effect. During the day, the walls slowly absorbed what little heat there was inside, and at night they slowly released it, smoothing out temperature fluctuations. Earth itself is an excellent insulator, and Sodi made full use of this principle. Such a house was partially or completely sunk into the ground, which provided additional protection. It was impervious to the wind, which simply blew over it. Inside the sod dugout, it was dark, cramped, and often damp, but the temperature remained relatively stable. Even in the most severe frosts, it rarely dropped to critical levels, while in a log cabin, water could freeze in a bucket a couple of meters from the fire. The weakest point of the dugout was the roof. It was made of poles, covered with a layer of grass, and topped with the same turf. Such a roof often leaked during rain or the spring thaw. This was the price they paid for thermal insulation. Settlers had to constantly fight dampness, which was an inevitable part of life in such a house. At the same time, the inhabitants of log cabins waged a constant war against the cold. Their main task was caulking, the process of sealing the gaps between the logs. It was a never-ending job that had to be done every year before winter, and often throughout the winter. Frost and wind constantly found new loopholes, and every draft was a direct threat to heat reserves. They used whatever was at hand for caulking. Moss was considered the ideal material because it compacted well and did not let air through. But more often than not, a mixture of clay, sand, and dry grass was used. This mixture was short-lived. It dried out, cracked, and fell out due to the vibrations of the house and the wind, forcing the owners to do the work over and over again. Inside log houses, the walls were often covered with cloth or old blankets. This was not done for aesthetic reasons. The fabric created an additional air barrier that slowed down drafts slightly. In the harshest conditions, the walls could even be covered with old newspapers, if they could be obtained. Each layer of paper added a little insulation. The dugout, despite its primitiveness, was a more complete structure. It had almost no gaps through which the wind could penetrate. The turf walls were monolithic and did not have the problems faced by log cabin owners. It was a simple and ingenious engineering solution dictated by the environment itself. As a result, the settlers were faced with a difficult choice. A log cabin was lighter, drier, and more like a real house, but it required a huge amount of fuel and constant maintenance. A dugout was dark, damp, and cramped, but it ensured survival with minimal resource consumption. Which of these types of housing would you choose, knowing about these disadvantages? But even the warmest house is useless if there is no source of heat inside. And in the next chapter, you will learn that the secret was not in the fire itself, but in how it was moved around the house. What if I told you that everything you believed about fireplaces was wrong? The romantic image of a family warming themselves by a large open hearth was one of the most dangerous fantasies on the frontier. An open fireplace was, in fact, a giant pump that sucked warm air out of the room and expelled it outside through the chimney. At the same time, it drew in icy air from outside through every crack in the house. The truly revolutionary invention that made survival on the prairies possible was the cast iron stove. This device was the heart of the home and the center of life during the winter months. Its efficiency compared to a fireplace was remarkable. Firstly, it was made of metal, which radiated heat in all directions, evenly heating the room, not just the space in front of the firebox. Second, the cast iron stove was airtight. Air for combustion was supplied through a controlled damper, which allowed the intensity of the flame to be regulated. This meant that wood or other fuel burned slowly and efficiently, giving off maximum heat. The stove could run for hours on a single load, maintaining the temperature throughout the night, which was unthinkable for an open fireplace. Fuel was a separate problem. In the wooded areas of the Rocky Mountains, it was firewood, and gathering it was the main job for men from summer to late fall. A huge amount of wood was needed to survive the winter. On the Great Plains, where there were almost no trees, settlers were forced to use what they called prairie fuel. This consisted of dried grass, sunflower stalks, or corn cobs. The uniqueness of survival lay not only in the production of heat, but also in its management and movement. Heat was a resource that had to be accumulated and used wisely. Families could not afford to heat the entire house, so all life was concentrated in one room, usually the kitchen where the stove was located. Simple but ingenious devices were used to capture the heat. One of them was steatite, or soapstone. It was a dense stone that heated up slowly, but also cooled down very slowly. The stones were kept on the stove and then, wrapped in cloth, placed in beds an hour before bedtime. They warmed the bed, making it possible to sleep in a cold house. A similar principle was used in so-called piglets, ceramic or metal containers that were filled with hot water from the boiler on the stove. These piglets were also placed in bed or under the feet while working in the house. They were personal, portable heaters that saved fuel by not heating the entire room to a high temperature. The heat from the stove was used to the maximum. Poles or ropes were always hung above the stove to dry clothes. Any moisture in clothing in the cold meant serious danger. Constant drying was as important a process as cooking. The stove was the center of this domestic universe, performing dozens of functions at once. Families often slept together, not because of lack of space, but for warmth. Beds were placed as close to the stove as possible. The further away from the heat source, the lower the temperature in the room. Frost could form on the walls in the far corners, while it was hot near the stove. This simple physics of heat accumulators, whether soapstone, hot water, or the cast iron stove itself, was the difference between survival and failure. The settlers couldn't change the weather, but they learned to masterfully manage the small amount of energy they had. If you find these engineering tricks fascinating, don't forget to like this video. Guess what was the settlers' main enemy that couldn't be seen? It was the draft. The imperceptible movement of icy air penetrating seemingly solid walls could negate all efforts to heat the house. Fighting drafts was not a one-time event, but a constant, exhausting war that lasted all winter. Every crack was a breach in the defense. This problem was particularly acute in log cabins. As we have already mentioned, caulking was a vital process. But the fact is that wood is a living material. Temperature and humidity fluctuations cause the logs to dry out and warp, creating gaps between them again. What had been sealed tightly in the fall could be letting air through again by the middle of winter. The settlers had to constantly inspect the walls. They did this with a candle. Where the flame began to flicker or go out, there was a gap. Upon discovering a heat leak, they immediately set about repairing it, stuffing moss, tow, scraps of fabric, or the same clay mixture into the gap if the frost was not too severe for it to freeze before drying. In turf huts, the problem of drafts was not so acute, but they had their own weak point. The places where door and window frames joined the walls. These elements made of wood did not fit well with the floating turf walls. Gaps inevitably formed at the junction of different materials, which became the main sources of cold. Inside the house, additional lines of defense were used. Windows, which in the 19th century rarely had double glazing, were the weakest point. At night, they were not simply covered with curtains, but tightly closed with heavy wooden shutters from the inside. Sometimes the frames were stuffed with insulation for the winter, completely depriving the room of daylight in order to conserve heat. Another simple but effective solution was the so-called draft snakes. These were long fabric rolls stuffed with sand, sawdust, or just old rags. They were placed on windowsills and under doors to block the flow of cold air that flowed across the floor. This allowed warm air to be retained in the upper part of the room. Walls, especially those facing north, the coldest side, required special attention. If it was not possible to insulate them from the outside, it was done from the inside. Settlers who had access to newspapers stuck them on the walls in several layers. The printing ink and the paper itself created a good barrier against the wind. Wealthier families, or those who had been living in the house for several years, could afford to cover the walls with fabric. Sometimes they even used old blankets or carpets for this purpose. This created a room within a room effect, cutting off the living space from the cold exterior walls. An air gap was created, which served as additional insulation. Floors were another source of cold, especially in houses without basements. In log cabins, the floors were planked, and icy air could blow through the gaps between the boards from under the house. To combat this, the floors were covered with a layer of dry grass or straw, and homemade rugs or mats were laid on top. This daily, tedious work of sealing the home was absolutely necessary. Every degree of heat saved meant a saving of precious fuel and an increase in the chances of survival. It was micro-engineering on which lives depended. What other everyday tasks do you think came to the fore? In the next chapter, we will talk about a task that required superhuman efforts: obtaining water. Water is the basis of life, but in winter, on the frontier, it turned into a solid mineral that had to be mined like ore. All the usual sources became inaccessible. Streams and rivers were covered with a thick layer of ice. Wells, if they were shallow, also froze over. Providing water for the family became a difficult daily task. The most obvious way was to melt snow. At first glance, this seems like a simple solution. There was plenty of snow around. However, in practice, it was an incredibly inefficient and costly method. Freshly fallen snow is 90% air. A huge bucket filled to the brim with snow yielded only a small amount of water at the bottom after melting. To obtain enough water for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene needs, dozens of buckets of snow had to be melted. This whole process took place on the stove, which was already working at full capacity. This meant a huge consumption of precious fuel. Families quickly realized that melting snow was a last resort, not a permanent solution. A more preferable, albeit more laborious option, was to go to the nearest unfrozen spring or river. This meant that one member of the family had to take an axe or an ice pick and go to the water every day, regardless of the weather. There, they had to cut a hole in the ice, risking slipping and falling into the icy water. The ice on the rivers could be a meter thick or more. Cutting a hole was hard physical work that took a long time. Once access to water had been gained, it had to be scooped up with buckets and carried home. This was another difficult stage. The water in the buckets was heavy, and the way back was uphill or over slippery snow. Any drop spilled from the bucket instantly froze, creating an icy crust on clothing and the path. Carrying water home without spilling it or freezing oneself was a real art. Buckets of water were placed near the stove so that the ice that had formed on the surface would melt. There was another problem related to water, or rather steam. Constant boiling of water, cooking and melting snow filled the small house with moist air. This steam, rising, immediately settled on the cold walls and ceiling, especially in log cabins. It turned into frost, which covered all surfaces with a thick layer. During the day, when the stove was heated more intensely, this frost began to melt. Water dripped from the ceiling, making beds, clothes, and supplies damp. At night, this moisture froze again, and the cycle repeated itself. The house became a damp, chilly place. The constant dampness was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous, as it contributed to the deterioration of belongings and food. Controlling humidity was almost as difficult a task as controlling heat. It was necessary to find a balance, to provide the family with water, but at the same time not turn the house into an ice cave. Sometimes it was necessary to sacrifice heat, briefly opening the door or chimney to let the steam out, and with it, precious degrees of warmth. Those who had wells were in a better position, but even they had a hard time. The water in a bucket pulled up from the depths was ice cold. The rope in the well gate would freeze, making it dangerous to pull up the water. Every sip of water in winter was the result of hard work and careful logistics. What if I told you that bankruptcy on the frontier did not mean losing money, but an empty cellar? Winter was won or lost in the fall. The entire survival strategy was based on how successfully a family managed to gather and, more importantly, preserve the harvest. Every calorie stored during the warm months was a coin in the bank that allowed them to live until spring. The main storage place for this wealth was the root cellar. It was just as important as the house itself. It was dug into the ground, often on a hillside, to ensure natural drainage. The walls and ceiling were reinforced with logs and covered with a thick layer of earth. This design took advantage of the stable soil temperature, which remained above freezing all year round, but was still cool enough. Inside the cellar, there was a special microclimate, cool, dark, and slightly humid. These were ideal conditions for storing root vegetables. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, rutabagas. All of these were the basis of the winter diet. The vegetables were not simply piled up in a heap, but covered with dry sand or sawdust. This prevented them from touching each other and slowed down the rotting process. Other vegetables, such as cabbage, required a different approach. Heads of cabbage were hung from the cellar ceiling or wrapped in paper, if available. Pumpkins and squash, which had a hard rind, could be stored on the shelves for several months. Each type of vegetable required its own storage method, refined over centuries. Protein reserves were an equally important part of the calorie bank. Meat obtained in the fall had to be preserved without refrigerators. The main methods were salting, smoking, and drying. These processes were a real art, and a mistake in the recipe could ruin the entire supply. Large wooden barrels were used for salting. The products were tightly packed in layers and generously sprinkled with salt, which was one of the most valuable and expensive commodities on the frontier. The salt drew out moisture, creating an environment in which bacteria could not multiply. Supplies could be stored in such barrels for months, although they became very salty. Smoking was another popular method. A small smokehouse was built next to the house. The food was hung inside and treated with cold smoke from smoldering logs for many days or even weeks. The smoke not only preserved the food, but also gave it a specific taste and created a protective film on the surface. Drying was the simplest and most ancient method. Food was cut into thin strips and dried in the sun or by the fire until all moisture was removed. The resulting pieces, hard as wood, could be stored almost indefinitely. Before consumption, they were soaked in water or simply chewed. Grain, corn, wheat, rye, had to be stored in a dry place. It was kept in sacks or wooden chests in the house itself, often in the attic or in the porch. The main task was to protect it from moisture and rodents. The loss of grain reserves meant a hungry winter, as it was used to bake bread and cook porridge, the basis of the daily diet. Managing all these supplies was the main task of the housewife. She kept strict records, deciding what could be eaten today and what needed to be saved. A mistake in calculations was fatal. Surviving until spring meant stretching the calorie bank just enough to last until the first green shoots appeared. What do you think was more difficult, obtaining food or preserving it? In the next chapter, we will learn what people did in the endless darkness. Winter on the frontier was not only a time of cold, but also a time of darkness. Short days and long, seemingly endless nights exerted enormous psychological pressure. The world shrunk to a single room lit by the dim light of the stove. In these conditions, idleness, not work, was the main enemy. Routine and constant activity became an anchor that kept the mind from despair. The day was strictly structured. People got up before dawn to get all the housework done, while there was still some natural light. As soon as the sun set, which could be as early as 4 in the afternoon, the second part of the day began, devoted to indoor work. These tasks were just as important as gathering fuel or water. Lighting was a big problem. Candles, which we take for granted today, were a luxury or the result of painstaking labor. They were made by hand, by repeatedly dipping the wick into melted fat. It was a long and messy process. Wax was even more expensive, so most candles were made of tallow, which smoked and gave off an unpleasant odor. A more common source of light was the so-called Betty lamp, or simple oil lamp. These were small metal or clay bowls with a wick, into which any available fat was poured. They gave off a very dim, flickering light, sufficient only to avoid bumping into objects, but insufficient for comfortable reading or fine work. Despite the poor lighting, work continued. The men in the house repaired tools. They fixed broken axe and hammer handles, carved new teeth for rakes, and prepared equipment for spring work. They wove ropes from available materials and repaired shoes using old leather. Every item was used to the last. The women were no less busy. Their main task was to keep their clothes in good condition. In conditions where new fabric was incredibly valuable, darning and mending became an everyday art. Every sock and every shirt was darned countless times. Old clothes were not thrown away, but cut into strips, which were then sewn into quilts using the patchwork technique. Spinning and weaving, if the family had the skills and tools, were also winter activities. The wool obtained during the warm season had to be processed into yarn and then knitted into socks, mittens, and scarves. These warm items were worth their weight in gold. Every member of the family had to be provided with several layers of woolen clothing. Contrary to popular belief, children were not exempt from work. They did what they could. They helped sort grain, twist wicks for candles, comb wool, or simply throw fuel into the stove. Labor was collective, and everyone who could do something was involved in the process. This was not only economically necessary, but also important for maintaining discipline and morale. This monotonous, repetitive work, accompanied by the howling wind and the crackling of the fire in the stove, also had a therapeutic effect. It grounded people, gave them a sense of control over the situation, and left no time for empty fears. Every tool repaired or pair of socks knitted was a small victory over the chaos of winter. Evenings often ended with a group activity. Someone might read aloud by the light of a single lamp if the family had literate members and a book. But more often it was simply socializing, telling stories, or planning future spring work. This social connection, confined to a single cramped space, was as important for survival as warmth and food. In the icy world of the frontier, clothing was not just a way to cover the body or follow fashion. It was the last line of defense, a personal fortress that everyone wore. Choosing and caring for the right clothing was a matter of life and death. A mistake in the choice of material or neglecting repairs could have fatal consequences. The main principle that settlers learned very quickly was the principle of layering. They did not wear one heavy, thick garment. Instead, they wore several layers of light clothing. The secret was simple. The air trapped between layers of fabric is the best insulator. It was heated by body heat and created a protective cocoon. The key material was wool. Wool was a true miracle of nature, and the settlers valued it incredibly highly. The unique property of wool is that it retains its insulating properties even when wet. Its fibers are hollow inside, so they continue to trap warm air. In a world where it was very easy to get wet, this property saved lives. In contrast, cotton was known as the killer fabric. Cotton, which was cheap and comfortable in warm weather, became deadly in the cold. It absorbs moisture very quickly, whether sweat or melted snow, and completely loses all its insulating properties. A wet cotton shirt clinging to the body drew heat away at an alarming rate. A typical winter outfit for a settler consisted of several layers. Long underwear, ideally woolen, was worn next to the skin. This was followed by a woolen shirt and pants. A vest or sweater could be worn over this. Finally, outerwear, a thick jacket or coat, often made of oiled fabric, tarpaulin, protected against wind and moisture. Special attention was paid to protecting the extremities. The head, hands, and feet were the most vulnerable. People always wore hats or caps, knowing that most of the heat escapes through the head. Mittens were worn on the hands instead of gloves. In mittens, the fingers are together and warm each other, while in gloves, each finger cools separately. Protecting the feet was a science in itself. Settlers wore several pairs of woolen socks. Shoes had to be loose enough not to restrict blood circulation and to leave room for these layers. Tight shoes, even if they looked very warm, were a sure way to get frostbite quickly. Sometimes dry grass insoles were placed inside the boots for extra insulation. Clothing care was a constant task. Any hole or torn seam was not just an annoying trifle, but a serious breach in defense. Evenings were devoted to darning. Every scrap of fabric and every button was saved and reused. Clothes were worn until they were completely worn out, and then their parts were used for patches or patchwork quilts. The outer layer of clothing had to be windproof. Even the warmest wool sweater was useless in the open wind, which simply blew the warm air out of it. Therefore, something made of thick canvas or leather, if available, was always worn over the wool. This combination, a warming layer and a windproof barrier, was the formula for survival. This personal clothing engineering was as important as housing engineering. People were mobile fortresses, carrying their warmth with them. They understood that there were only a few layers of fabric between them in the icy void, and that everything depended on the quality and condition of that fabric. Survival in winter on the frontier was determined not only by the ability to build huts and stoke a stove, but also by geography itself. The simple distance between houses could mean the difference between life and death. There was a huge difference between a family living on an isolated plot and one that had neighbors within sight. Isolation was not just a difficulty, it became the main enemy. Winter in the vast expanses of North America could last 5 or 6 months, and every morning tested a person's endurance. For a family living on a secluded farm or in a deep valley, self-sufficiency was not a virtue but a necessity. They depended only on their own hands and the supplies they had managed to stock up on during the summer. When blizzards blocked the trails and rivers froze over, the world outside the window seemed to disappear. If an axe broke, you had to repair it yourself. If a harness broke or a saw handle cracked, you couldn't wait for help. After all, the nearest neighbor might be 20 kilometers away, and getting there meant risking death in a blizzard. Every little thing mattered. Losing a bucket, breaking a stove damper, or running out of salt could spell disaster. Salt, especially in cold weather, was essential for storing meat, for the normal functioning of the body, and for livestock. A shortage of salt turned winter into a test of survival. People counted every piece of bread, every log. If the fuel ran out before spring, it could mean the death of the entire family. Any unforeseen event, such as the illness of one of the adults, became a real crisis. If the father fell ill, the mother took on not only the care of the children, but also the heavy physical work, chopping wood, feeding the animals, and repairing the house. If the mother fell ill, the children, even the youngest ones, learned to cook, heat the stove, and care for their younger siblings. Children grew up quickly on the frontier because so much depended on them. The psychological strain was enormous. A week of loneliness could drive a person mad, and a month without human voices could break even the strongest. Life was completely different in small settlements, where several houses were within an hour's walk of each other. Here, another law came into play, the law of community. People understood that only together could they withstand nature. Everyone knew that if trouble struck, they would not be left alone. This awareness alone was as warming as fire. In winter, people united not only for survival, but also for humanity. Working together became a part of life. Men joined forces to cut a hole in the ice, fetch water, or chop wood. It was safer and faster that way. After all, alone, one could die of hypothermia or be hit by a falling tree. When a roof needed to be repaired or a new building needed to be erected after a fire, the whole community would gather to help. No one stood aside because they knew that tomorrow they themselves might need help. Women also played a key role in maintaining community ties. They often gathered in one house where it was warmest. There they sewed clothes, spun wool, repaired shoes, and discussed the latest news. These meetings were a salvation from loneliness, giving women a sense of normality in a world where every day was a struggle. Here they discussed recipes, medicines, even the fate of their children. Often little ones sat nearby, listening to stories of old times or psalms from the Bible. The exchange of resources was the basis of trust. If one family had a little flour left and another had dried meat or potatoes, they shared without hesitation. This was not considered charity. It was a form of mutual insurance. Today you give away some of what you have. Tomorrow they will bring you firewood or help you repair your roof. No debts or receipts. Everything was based on trust and respect. In winter, when any journey became dangerous, such a help bank was more important than money. It strengthened the bond between families. Sometimes neighbors simply exchanged warm clothes or candles, and these little things could save lives. The community was a living organism where everyone felt responsible, not only for themselves, but also for others. Faith occupied a special place. Even if the priest lived hundreds of kilometers away, people gathered in one house on Sundays. They read the Bible, sang psalms, and prayed together. These gatherings restored a sense of meaning and hope. Faith gave structure to time, turning endless winter days into a series of weeks, each with its own ritual. When a blizzard raged outside the window, communal prayer served as a reminder that winter would pass and spring would surely come. The first sign of victory was not sight, but sound. The sound of dripping water. When water began to drip from the roof, it meant that the grip of frost was weakening. For families who had endured months of icy numbness, this sound was sweeter than any music. It meant that they had survived. The thaw was not just a change of season, but the end of a long siege. When the snow began to melt, people came out of their shelters. The world around them was transformed, dirty, wet, but full of life. However, the people themselves were no longer the same as when they entered the winter. They were exhausted, their supplies were running out, but they were alive. And they were full of knowledge gained at the highest price. The first task after the thaw was to work on mistakes. Each family reviewed their experience. What worked? What went wrong? Where did the roof leak? Which corner of the house froze the most? Why did some of the supplies in the cellar spoil? The answers to these questions were the basis for preparing for the next winter. This was the simple engineering we are talking about. It was not an academic process, but a cycle of iterative design based on survival. If a family lived in a log cabin and struggled with drafts all winter, they would spend weeks in the summer recaulking every crack using a new, improved mixture of clay and moss. If the cellar was too damp, they dug a new one nearby in the summer, but this time taking into account their mistakes. Perhaps they added a ventilation pipe for better air circulation, or chose a location on a higher slope. Each surviving family became an expert in the microclimate, geology, and thermophysics of their plot. The same applied to the stove. If the stove smoked or consumed too much fuel, it was rebuilt. Perhaps the pipe was extended to improve the draft, or the design of the firebox was changed. This knowledge was passed on from neighbor to neighbor, and successful solutions were quickly copied and spread throughout the frontier. This engineering was based on a deep understanding of materials. People knew that a certain type of wood was best for tool handles because it did not splinter in the cold. They knew that clay from this ravine was ideal for plastering the stove. This knowledge was not recorded in books. It was written in the landscape and in the memories of those who survived. The combination of labor, faith, and engineering was not just a nice phrase. Labor was the daily methodical work of sustaining life. Engineering was the constant adaptation and improvement of their shelters and tools. And faith was psychological resilience, the confidence that their efforts were not in vain and that spring would surely come. The families that survived were not necessarily the strongest or the richest. They were the most adaptable. They knew how to observe, learn from their mistakes, and immediately apply the knowledge they gained in practice. They were true survival engineers who built their lives literally from the earth, wind, and fire. The legacy of these families is not only the land they cultivated, it is the invaluable experience of human adaptation to extreme conditions. They proved that the human mind, will, and ability to cooperate can defeat even the most ruthless enemy, the icy, silent winter of the frontier. We conclude our immersion into the icy world of the American frontier. We have seen that survival in winter was not just a matter of endurance, but a complex engineering task. Every detail of daily life, from the thickness of the walls of a dugout to the method of darning socks, was part of a well-thought-out strategy. These families, living on the edge of civilization, were true innovators. They used simple but ingenious solutions to manage heat, water, and light. Their lives were a daily feat, combining hard work, a deep understanding of nature, and an unyielding will to live. What other topics from American frontier history or other eras would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in railroad construction, the life of mountain hunters, or survival techniques in the deserts of the Southwest. Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes.